Hi, welcome back to our YouTube channel. Today we will be starting our new series, International Relations in Real Life, IRL. In today's video, we have Matias Salo, our Latin American editor, and Paula Arrus, our staff writer, and we will be discussing about Latin America's economy, particularly Argentina's debt crisis. So, on to Paula.
Well, so basically what's happening right now in Argentina is that the last incumbent president, Macri, decided to restructure the debt that they had with the IMF, and the new president, Fernandez, is having to take sort of like this new process and trying to make sure that Argentina gets a good deal.
Okay.
Exactly. When Macri was elected, as you put in your article, he had this kind of fanfare, international fanfare, that now Argentina is going to turn a new leaf of economic prosperity, but he embarked on this economic restructuring program, basically with more state spending trying to stimulate the economy, but unfortunately the investors lost faith, and now there is a massive risk of another default in Argentina's history. It would be its 9th in total.
And I think this also represents like a larger general trend in the world where basically confidence is, I think, at all-time low levels. Demand is slowing or at least not growing. And we all know that interest rates in central banks are either negative or they're really, really low, maybe reaching zero. So I think that countries will need to find new economic growth drivers during this time.
It's actually incredible because if we look at the post-crisis in 2008, what should happen is that debt levels relating to GDP should lower, and then interest rates should go up. But interest rates are again almost at zero level, and then government debt is still at a high level. So it means that when the next crisis comes, as is happening in Argentina more widely in the global markets, there's no room for governments to play anymore with the economy, which is a massive macroeconomic problem. And we can see this now in Argentina.
Yeah, of course. It basically means that monetary policies like Keynes proposed about changing interest rates and the money supply in the economy will be essentially deemed ineffective. And I guess that the state will only be left with fiscal policy, but that's an issue as well because that raises up government budget deficits, which is what's happening in Argentina.
Yeah, the state is out of ammunition when it comes to the economy.
So do you guys think that what's happening in Argentina has any wider impact on the economy of Latin America in general?
I think that a prolonged downfall of the Argentinian economy would create economic instability in the region, but I think it's a bit unclear how it would affect other countries. I think that Latin American economies are mostly affected by external factors such as Chinese demand. Maybe now with China having a bit of issues on trade, it will probably slow down, but I'm not sure how exactly the Argentine crisis could impact the entire region.
Yeah, these are export-heavy economies, almost all of them, but they export usually to the rest of the world. There's of course inter-South American trade, but the majority of this impact is the rest of the world. So it will have the Argentine recession will have some effects on the neighboring nations, but it won't bring down the whole South American economy. It's not just restructured in that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, especially since Latin America is known for exporting mostly primary products. And do you think that will have any impact on, China's trade relationship with Latin America? Do you think Latin America is probably going to be more dependent on Chinese FDI in the coming years?
Well, it might right now, Latin America, I think it's incredibly dependent on Chinese demand. I think it was Brazil who's basically one of the largest trading partners with China. Right now, with the coronavirus thing, I'm sure the Chinese demand has definitely slowed down and trade routes will be canceled. So yeah, I think that Latin America is bracing itself for a really, really, really difficult decade.
And moreover, it goes to the fundamentals of why these nations are so vulnerable to economic downturns, is that they are again primary products. They haven't diversified the economic base. So when the world market goes down, they go down with it, basically. So.
Yeah. Okay, so now back onto the Argentina's question, but are there any underlying structural problems that you think led to the sovereign debt in Argentina?
I think that the underlying structural problems are essentially bureaucratic, both from Argentina and the IMF. What this means is that basically Argentinian politicians have been spending in excess of what they can pay back. they've basically not been living within their means, which, again, as I mentioned in the article, they are a lot. Argentina is a huge exporter of wines, of meat, and they can't pay their debts. It's just that the IMF has exacerbated this issue, but basically restructuring their debts, lending them more money, but not being able to fix the economy in a way that GDP can grow, unemployment can go down, wages can go up. So yeah, it's basically fed an unsustainable cycle of borrowing and not being able to repay your loans on time.
Yeah, it is in a way ironic that it is now again the Peronist government of the way of Kirchners who are responsible of fixing this problem, because the Kirchners and the Peronists, or the Peronist movement has been in the driving power of Argentinian politics since the 1950s, and they are the power that may basically cause these problems. They have widely in their history done fiscal spending over their means. The budgets have almost never been in balance, and Argentina has spent 33% of its recent history in recession, the second longest period in the world after the Democratic Republic of Congo. It has widely schizophrenic economic policies. They have changed their tax code over 80 times in the last 30 years, the fiscal rules like 14 times, 64 central bank governors in the last 80 years. There's no continuity, and it's very hard, for example, for international investors to trust and have confidence in the economy if the winds of politics and of economic policy changes that fast.
Okay. So you guys talked about like sovereign debt, and I think you mentioned earlier that a lot of Latin American economies also depend on demand externally from other international countries. So to what extent do you think that the crisis currently in Argentina is limited to sovereign debt, or are there any other external factors that are acting as well?
Well, right now, global government debt has reached, I think, $66 trillion, which equals like 80% of world GDP, which basically means that all of this money is being borrowed by governments and basically to refinance their long-term debts. Whether this could become an issue in the future, I think it depends on how much we consider is too much debt. Again, with confidence being low and central banks maintaining very low interest rates, I think that countries will have to discover new drivers of economic growth. But I think a sovereign debt bubble may well be forming globally as well. Debt and bondholders will have to remain confident on countries' abilities to pay back their loans. Otherwise, I think that the market would just bust.
And especially with Argentina, their debt isn't. It relates to the current recession, but it is really a symptom of the underlying problems we outlined previously. Like the inflation is still there, unemployment is still there, the primary nature of the economy is still there. It's not an open economy in any way. So.
And it's also insane. Argentina has actually a maturity bond that's 100 years old.
Yeah.
So they're basically selling bonds that will be repayable in 100 years' time.
Exactly. And the Argentinians, their methods of tackling these things is very weird. Like the new government basically said that we're going to have price controls on basic commodities to restrict inflation. But it does not work like that. No. They try to control inflation in ways they're just wishing it away.
Okay, so what do you guys think is the public opinion on this issue, not just in Argentina, but also in Latin America more generally?
Well, I think public opinion is a tough one, mainly because, as you mentioned, the problem is so economically dense and based that it requires such an understanding of macroeconomic policies and theories and sovereign debt markets that not many people have. So I think that Latin American people essentially react like many others to physical and visible changes in their life. So again, if you go to the grocery store and you see that there's an increase in the price of milk, then you obviously go and protest or something as small, like in Chile when the transport fares going up 10 cents. For them it was massive because the inequalities in Chile are so big that if you just bump up the prices a little bit of the working class, then you're going to get a massive backlash. So I think that basically if the Argentine government is forced to reduce spending on the welfare systems, then this might spark a lot of protest as well. So it's a very complicated process because in a way the Argentinian government must reduce budget deficits, but taking away all of the welfare programs can also put in a very difficult positions to a lot of poor Argentinians who may not have enough money to buy food or shelter or clothes or water. So yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah, the central problem is that the parent government of Argentina is fundamentally a populist government.
Yep.
And populists love to spend public money.
Yeah.
And when public money is no longer available, it's a problem. So yeah, I agree. Argentina, there's no good option for the Argentinian government currently. And I think there's currently a tension inside the government. There's President Fernandez, who I think has a more moderate economic policy and is trying to somehow restructure that. And then there's a Vice President Kirchner, who has this more traditional Peronist populist view on economics. So it's interesting to see how that relationship moves, and that will determine quite a lot what is the ultimate economic response of Argentina.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good leeway into the next question, but most of the countries within Latin America, they're experiencing this sort of shift from socialist policies or socialist governments to more liberal governments backed by the West, particularly the United States. Do you think there's a pattern? Why is this happening? It's sort of like, looks like it started from Venezuela, it's happening in Brazil, it's happening pretty much everywhere. Is there a pattern to it? What's the discussion around that?
I don't know if there's a pattern, to be fair, because in Argentina, like as we've been talking, there's a populist leader in place which has some socialist policies, but maybe leaning a bit to the center as well. But in Brazil, we have President Bolsonaro, who could be the embodiment of a far-right politician. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not just talking about like the socialist left or the liberal right shift, but rather it's just a populist shift, I think. I think the people in Latin America are tired of like picking up the newspaper and just reading like about another corruption scandal or how their tax dollars are being spent by dishonest politicians. So yeah, I think that the attitude towards our political systems is that they're rotten to the core, and only a new generation of political and economic leaders will, get these countries out of the problems that they're in.
It's interesting that because there has been a shift in Latin American countries where, like in the 2010s, there had been quite good social progress in countries like Brazil, in Peru, and even in like pre-crisis Venezuela, even if there were underlying issues there. But since then, there has been an incredible amount of stagnation in the economy. There have been moderate growth, but inequality has risen quite a bit. And to the issue of corruption, something that has to be mentioned is the Odebrecht corruption scandal that basically brought down the whole South American political elite, which is quite incredible. Basically, no politician, and especially these were centre-left politicians often at this time, so it basically corrupted and disqualified them from political office, and that's still having an impact on why, for example, centre-left politicians especially are viewed with some kind of caution. So it provided maybe an opening to more moderate or center-right politicians. But it's a very volatile region. Like the last year, if anyone has been following South American politics, it's been incredibly topsy-turvy.
And I think this also brings us back to the idea that Latin America depends a lot on how the world economy is going. Like as you said, in the 2000s, maybe early 2010s, Latin America was growing great.
Yes,
everything was going good. Quality of life was improving. However, then we had, the recession in 2008, and then the recovery was not that great. And then the Odebrecht corruption scandals came to light. So basically the whole political elite, Odebrecht was this massive construction company that had a lot of projects around Latin America, and basically they got concessions from governments, but these concessions came with money around the back. So yeah, basically when investigations started to occur, the whole political elite in Brazil came down. There were a lot of connections in Peru. One president had to resign, PPK. And yeah, it's basically been widespread.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Nothing to add.
Okay, so thank you for tuning in to IRL. We'll see you next time.